Welcome to the next lecture on EU-Russian relations. Previously we talked about the EU's activeness, about EU foreign policy ideas, EU foreign policy institutions. We also covered Russian foreign policy ideas, Russian foreign policy institutions. And last time we discussed the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement and TASIS and their contribution to EU-Russian relations. Today we are going to speak about common spaces. Something that emerged at the turn of this century and something that was supposed to advance EU-Russian relations. So common spaces, why the name? Yeah? The name is of course very strange, especially when it comes to English, but the rationale behind was quite clear. On the one hand, Russia and the European Union wanted to upgrade their relations, to advance them somehow. On the other hand, they didn't want to specifically, clearly define what they were going to reach. And therefore they searched to avoid a free trade area, a custom union or common market, and therefore they came up with a common space. Furthermore, the need was felt because Russia, just around that time, was offered a place in the European neighborhood policy, but because it was a universal policy for all neighbors of the European Union, because it was driven by the European Union, Russia declined. So a common space emerged as a compromise solution between Russia and the European Union. And initially, Russia and the European Union started talking about common European economic space. Common European economic space, as a term, emerged in 2001. This was the date when it was mentioned for the first time, and the idea behind it was to draw on the positive experience of the energy dialogue in terms of using legal approximation, in terms of linking private activities and public activities, but to spread this experience of the energy dialogue on wider economic relations, on wider economic cooperation. And a high-level group was set up. The high-level group consisted of Viktor Hristenko on the Russian side, the Vice Prime Minister, and Chris Patel, Commissioner for External Affairs on the EU side. Their work was supported by expert groups, and at some point, in 2 years, they came up with a concept of the common European economic space, which read that the overall objective of the common European economic space in broad terms was to link EU and Russia in a privileged relationship commensurate with their proximity. The shaping of the common European economic space may, as the concept said, in the longer run serve as a major area of the strategic partnership between Russia and the European Union. This was, of course, a very abstract goal and nobody knew how to implement it. So the parties looked for further details. They met in May 2003 in St. Petersburg for a summit which was meant to commemorate the 300th anniversary of St. Petersburg and at the same time to advance EU-Russian relations. Many interesting decisions were taken at that time, and in particular the parties decided to develop roadmaps for 4 common spaces. Besides the common economic space, they wanted to deal with common space for external security, common space for internal security, common space for education and science, including cultural aspects. And therefore, they decided to prepare 4 roadmaps. The word roadmap is significant because it's not an action plan, like in the case of the European neighborhood policy. It's not a unilateral EU document. That was important for Russia. It's a bilateral document, and the parties truly worked on it, both of them. And of course, a roadmap doesn't have any legal status. It's not legally binding, and therefore it gives flexibility to both sides on whether to implement it or not implement it. The parties came up with this decision, and roadmaps were eventually prepared in 2005, and this was when they were signed. Michael Emerson, a former EU's ambassador to Russia and an expert in EU-Russian relations, called roadmaps Euro-Ruski diplomatic bureaucratic borscht, an encyclopedic list of different topics. There are 400 different points structured in the common economic space, common space for external security, common space for internal security, and common space on education and science, including cultural aspects. Let's look at all 4 roadmaps one by one. And the first one is the roadmap for common space on external security. 5 priorities were outlined. Cooperation in the international arena. That was natural, because Russia and the European Union both positioned themselves as global actors. Fight against international terrorism. Again, a very shared agenda, especially in 2005. Non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and arms control. Cooperation on the management of local conflicts. And cooperation in the field of civil protection. Seems quite straightforward. However, there were several contradictions in this common space for external security. Firstly, the European Union tried to put reference to specific values: human rights, democracy, the rule of law. These references were eventually deleted because Russia just wanted to speak about common values, perceiving that references to specific values would be like an effort to teach a lesson to Russia just one more time. Furthermore, there was a very big and difficult discussion on joint peacekeeping, because Russia wanted to have a say on peacekeeping operations where it took part. The EU was ready to accept Russian contribution, but at the same time not to give Russia a right to actually have a say in those operations. That was, of course, conceptually not acceptable for Russia. And then, of course, the third contradiction in the common space on external security was a contradiction about shared neighborhood, with the definition result-oriented EU-Russian collaboration and dialogue, and respect for the integration projects of as sovereign decisions of the states on the one hand, and Russia wishing to delete specific references to CIS countries and to peacekeeping operations there. And that was a very clear illustration of the increased controversy, of the increased competition in the shared neighborhood policy. Common economic space. There is a shared consensus between Russia and the European Union that this common space is central for EU-Russian cooperation, and this is probably the biggest roadmap, the longest roadmap out of all 4. The idea behind was to create an open and integrated market between the European Union and Russia. The word market was pretty much there, but it was not clear whether it would be an internal market in the way the European Union understands it. Secondly, the idea behind was to bring down barriers to trade and investments, to promote reforms and competitiveness based on principles of non-discrimination. And of course, there was no single mention of a free trade area, precisely because the parties could not agree on the concept of a free trade area. At the same time, there was an abundant section devoted to different networks: telecommunication networks, energy networks, transportation networks, and this was, the idea behind was to link Russia and the European Union in a physical way. Of course, there were controversies, of course, there were conflicts in the common economic space as well. Firstly, and probably the most important issue for Russia, was the issue of equality, and that basically came out as an issue of whether Russia would unilaterally move in the direction to the EU's legislation, to the EU's terminology, to the alignment with the EU's law, or whether Russia and the European Union will be moving towards each other, will be convergent. As a solution to this problem, because the European Union, of course, wanted to see a unilateral approximation, whether Russia was ready only to a reciprocal movement. As a solution to this problem, Russia and the European Union decided to omit some references to the EU's terminology and to put references to international institutions like the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations, the Helsinki Convention, and that was sort of like a deal between Moscow and Brussels, because referring to international organizations and to international instruments allowed Russia to actually speak about better equality. There was also a new approach introduced in the common space, and the new approach basically talked about the readiness of both parties to discuss various issues and determine areas of cooperation, but also to identify possibilities for recognition of various results and of conformity assessment. So that was a new approach which Russia and the European Union started implemented very slowly after 2005. There were some open disputes that were mentioned in the roadmaps, like the phytosanitary certificates, Siberian overflights, the rights to fly over Siberia. These issues were not sorted out. There was no solution of whether Russia and the European Union would move to the overall agreement that included all fields of cooperation, or whether they would move to sectoral agreements. And they tried to sort of like avoid any commitment of EU resources. That was sort of like a very genuine effort was made in this direction. Common space on freedom, security and justice. Well, again, what were the goals? The underlying principles of democracy, human rights and the rule of law were mentioned, and that was important for the European Union. Russia sort of like agrees with this mentioning, but at the same time Russia tried to decrease the very same mention in other parts of the roadmaps. The parties agreed with a joint fight against crimes and illegal activities like money laundering, like drug trafficking, human trafficking, corruption. The parties agreed to intensify anti-terrorist cooperation, to facilitate free movement of citizens and readmission agreements, to cooperate on border control, and to increase the efficiency of the judicial system. The efficiency of the judicial system was, of course, a stone in the Russian direction. But that was not the most salient controversy in the field of area of justice and home affairs. The most salient issue was probably in the fact that Russia and the European Union had different expectations from this space. Russia wanted to have a visa-free travel as soon as possible, and that resulted from the feeling that the European Union was a difficult partner and the only good that it could bring was a visa-free travel with the majority of its member states. At the same time, the European Union insisted on shared values, and in a way the European Union made visa-free travel conditional on Russia's respect of human rights, democracy and the rule of law, but we will look at it a bit later. Furthermore, the European Union talked about border agreements which were absent with some member states of the European Union, or between Russia and some member states of the European Union. The European Union, of course, wanted to make sure that no additional financial resources are committed through this roadmap. Russia insisted, on the other hand, on better border management, on more efficient border management, and more transparent border management. And Russia, of course, prioritized in that particular common space fight against crime, fight against terrorist activities. Russia wanted to conclude a separate agreement on extradition and wanted to become a part of the European arrest warrant. That didn't happen because of the lack of trust between Russia and the European Union, but that tells a lot about the ambitions that Russia had in respect to this space and the overall results. And finally, common space on research and education, including cultural aspects. The idea behind was to create a common space of research and education and to basically capitalize on the mutual strengths of both Russia and the European Union, of their research communities, of their cultural heritage, of their intellectual heritage. The parties, in fact, had the very same ambition of building a knowledge-based economy, promoting competitiveness, advancing higher education. Russia became a part of the campus exchange program, a part of the Erasmus exchange program, and in that sense, Russian educational system was better included into a European space. But at the same time, some controversial issues included modalities of Russia's inclusion into EU-funded research projects. It was not clear how much Russia had to contribute and the extent to which European funding could cover Russia-related activities. It was difficult to cooperate in the field of education due to the recognition of disciplines, of diplomas, of certificates, and of course the problem of scientific cooperation was quite slight as well in terms of the modalities of this cooperation, but also in terms of the intellectual property rights. So these were 4 roadmaps for 4 common spaces that Russia and the European Union concluded. If we look at the overall structure of these roadmaps, we clearly see an asymmetry of partners and spaces, with Russia being bigger in the political space and the European Union clearly being bigger in the economic space. The roadmaps, although they were very detailed, didn't outline a very specific project, didn't define clearly the final goal. It was rather an enumeration of the various fields of cooperation that already existed, and it could be compared to sort of like a midterm program more than anything else. Because there was no clearly defined goal, it didn't have any measurable indicators, and therefore, of course, the European Commission produced regular reports on 3 out of 4 roadmaps, with the exception of the common space on external security, and it tried to sort of like find some sort of a progress, but at the same time, when you don't have clear measurable indicators, it's very difficult to actually prove that you either have achieved something or have not achieved anything. The institutional provisions were not very clearly defined either, and of course there was no monitoring mechanism, although Russia insisted on it. And that was interesting. Russia insisted on a specific monitoring mechanism, but the European Union didn't have any ambition to create any set of new institutions. And therefore I have a quote from Michael Emerson, who notoriously said that we pretend to be convergent on common European values, and they pretend to be helping us to do that. We, in this case, the European Union, and they, in this case, Russians. So he just argued that that was a game of mutual fake, on both sides. The roadmaps, of course, covered mostly technical aspects, but at the same time, if all points of the roadmaps had been implemented, Russia and the European Union would have an unprecedented depth of relations. Depth of the relations that neither the European Union nor Russia have with any sort of like other player. So in that sense, I mean, yes, it's technical, but at the same time, we shouldn't overestimate the scope of the 4 documents. There were various decisions on consultations and dialogues, and indeed many dialogues would be set up following the roadmaps, and I will tell you about the dialogues in a minute. But before I proceed to the dialogues, I would like to address the question of what keeps the 4 roadmaps together. And here we have a big debate between Russia and the European Union, with Russia saying that actually each space has to progress with its own speed. And the European Union initially arguing that there was a need for a shared preamble, and that all 4 roadmaps had to advance with the same speed. Well, it's of course very difficult to measure the speed and to say that it's the same speed in economics, politics, and justice and home affairs. But that was the point of the European Union, and in that sense we see a clear disagreement between Russia and the European Union, the disagreement that they have never been able to bridge. The dialogues. The dialogues became a mode of the implementation of the 4 common economic spaces. In fact, the dialogues were set up in many economic fields. Most of the dialogues are on economics, on investment, intellectual property rights, on regulation and industrial production, on telecommunication and information society. You have a full list in the slide, and I'm not going to repeat it, but you see that quite a lot of dialogues were set up. There was a dialogue on visas, there was a dialogue on readmission, there was a dialogue on a visa-free travel, there was a dialogue on political and security cooperation, just to cite you cases when dialogues were set up on non-economic issues as well. Dialogues, in fact, differed a lot, and modes of cooperation differed as well, but there was some sort of a shared structure in the dialogue. Well, first of all, dialogues were a way to exchange opinions on various issues, yeah? And to move from a conflict mode to a cooperation mode through some sort of socialization. In terms of common features, most dialogues would have terms of reference with clear goals and sort of like steps that were outlined to measure progress. Furthermore, most dialogues involved various stakeholders, officials, non-governmental organizations, business, if we talk about economic issues. Most dialogues had regular meetings at different levels, at the expert level, at the official level, and most dialogues served for the purpose of the information exchange and for the purpose of socialization, but also for the purpose of drafting some shared understanding. And in particular, that was the case with the energy dialogue. In terms of the factor of success, definitely participation of stakeholders, especially business, contributed to the success of some economic dialogues, like the dialogue in energy or the dialogue on the construction business. But at the same time, many generated ideas were not implemented or were just like left in the audience without any further progress, to the disappointment of the participants. Most of the dialogues were suspended in 2014. Yeah, they survived until 2014 and they were suspended. Some dialogues, some groups meet either as ad hoc meetings, yeah, that is the most frequent strategy. Sometimes they meet as dialogues, that's more rare, because the European Union prefers to keep the contacts with Russia modest. But definitely dialogues are a very significant contribution to EU-Russian relations, precisely because they allowed for the involvement of transgovernmental level, which is composed of low-level officials, and transnational level, meaning business and civil society organizations. And the spread of the dialogues was definitely the result of the 4 roadmaps or 4 common spaces which emerged in 2005. And with that description, I finish our lecture of today on roadmaps, on the dialogues, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again at our next lectures.